When we transmit our language to our children and maybe are the only ones or one of the few who regularly speak our language with them, we normally use informal language in casual settings during our daily interactions. Sometimes our children pick up some formal language through observing, listening to others, mainly adults, when they speak to each other. But it's not very common for our children to become confident users of formal language. The older our children get, the more society expects them to function in a variety of settings with different people. And this also includes formal settings. Welcome to Activities for Multilingual Families, where we share ideas to help you foster your languages in a fun and compelling way. And today we share with you ways to help your children understand social rules or for when to use formal language, and we'll make also some examples from the languages Yoshito and I cover. Formal language use can vary significantly across different languages due to cultural norms, linguistic features, and societal contexts.
How often our children are in situations where they have to speak formally will depend largely on the expectations of our culture and language. So for example, in France, children speak colloquially to their family, friends, no matter the age. They would only be required to speak formally to an adult they don't know, such as a shopkeeper, or generally their friend's parents. On the other hand, in Korea, children are expected to speak formally to every adult, whether they are family or not. So my sons have learned to speak formally and informally in Korean since they were about 6 or 7. So by now, they're quite used to it. On the other hand, in France or in French, because they use formal language so rarely, I need to create situations where they will learn to do it. So here's how I do it, and if you have any other suggestions, please let us know in the comments. The first step is to raise our children's awareness of the fact that there are different ways of talking, some that are used with friends, others with teachers, shopkeepers, your elders, etc. Certain languages have more ways of speaking formally than others, but at that stage, the aim is simply to make them aware that there are differences depending on who we address. And more often than not, we need to point that out so that they really notice it and can start integrating these differences. The way I started introducing this to my sons was by saying goodbye to them when I go to work. I actually tell them to have fun, to set a positive tone to their day. And I started by saying "Amusez-vous bien, monsieur," instead of "Amuse-toi bien." And to make it more obvious, so I would change my attitude and tone of voice depending on whether I would say it formally or informally. So when it was informal, I would give them a big hug and a big kiss to say goodbye and say "Amuse-toi bien." But when it was more formal, I would just stay at a distance and say "Amusez-vous bien, monsieur." So quite a big change. Amusez-vous bien.
Amuse-toi bien.
Oui. Once our children are aware of the fact that there is formal and informal speech, it is important to model before they can produce it on their own. So when I say "Amusez-vous bien, monsieur," my sons generally repeat. So that's a way of modeling because they can hear me and then they can copy. But there are loads of different ways to model, and pretend plays are great for that. So my youngest, for example, loves Legos. So when we play, I can introduce a scenario where there will be some sort of hierarchy that will lead me to speak formally. And recently we watched The Chronicles of Narnia. While watching the film, I helped my son notice the formal speech by repeating solemnly what some of the characters were saying, and I would also casually say that they were speaking politely and why. And also another thing that helped is that my wife, who is Korean and speaks very well French, sometimes didn't understand the word. So I would explain again what it meant and say it was a polite way of saying it when you speak to a king or queen, etc.
Il vous lance un défi. C'est vous contre lui. Et celui qui gagne, il aura Narnia. Si vous perdez, vous devrez partir à tout jamais. Et les Narniens récupéreront leur terre.
Then, when we played the scenes from the film, we reenacted them. I made sure that my son was the lion or someone higher ranking than me, so that I could address him formally. And later on, we swapped the roles, so I was someone higher ranking than me, so he could address me formally. So again, just to make it clear, I said that I wanted to be a certain character, for example the lion, so that he could use that formal language. I didn't mention at all that I wanted him to start speaking formally. And then I corrected him by repeating correctly what he was trying to say, or simply by staying in my character and act like I was offended that he would dare speaking to me in such and such way.
Hassan, souhaite-moi bonne chance. Je te souhaite bonne chance. Roi Peter, tu es le plus fort.
So pretend plays in general are very effective. Role plays are a good example as well to help children get into a character and use formal language. One thing that was really helpful as well for Korean is an app we found a couple of years ago that was a dubbing. It was made for dubbing. So you had a certain scene, and you were one of the characters. So you could hear the character say it in with their voice, and then you could record yourself to talk over the character so that your voice was instead of that character. It's very fun, especially when you see the characters all excited and running around, etc. But if you choose a scene where there is this kind of formal, informal speeches that are included, it can be very useful for that as well.
수고하셨어요. 수고하셨습니다.
쓰지 말입니다.
어서 오십시오. 아직 퇴근들 안 했나? 다들 애사심이 훌륭하구만. 마음에 들어.
And when you get a chance to visit your home country, it's a good idea to help your child order from the waiter or ask things to your shopkeeper directly by using the formal language they are supposed to be using in this real life situation. Real life situations are really powerful to help our children remember better how to speak formally and informally.
Like I mentioned before, the older our children get, the more society expects them to distinguish between formal and informal use of language and correctly do so, no matter if it is in their first languages or any additional one. So the easiest way for our children to learn formal language is when we lead by example. Our children learn a lot by observing and imitating parents, caregivers, other adults, older siblings. And when our children are younger, we can use formal language when role-playing, like Yoshito just mentioned. If we introduce formal language early on, once our children are teenagers, they will feel more confident using it. As we are raising multilingual and multicultural children, chances are quite high that these conventions differ across our languages. Now, know when to use formal language in the target language. Here are some contexts when using formal language is generally required. When you're communicating with an adult that you don't know well, when you communicate with an adult or elderly in general, in public settings with adults, when talking to superiors, or during job interviews. There are other contexts, but these are the major ones, I might say. What changes? Formal language requires more complex sentence structures, that's to say they become longer, and less personal pronouns. In English, we are more likely to use we as a pronoun instead of I, and one avoids colloquial or slang terms. When talking to an adult in Dutch, we may still be allowed to use the informal je instead of u, but there are situations where the u is required, like when talking with elderly or an adult in a very formal setting. When speaking with a French adult, you'd need to use vous, in Italian lei or voi, in German Sie with the capital S, and also use the plural verb forms. Here are a few examples in French. Excusez-moi, où se trouve le rayon des gâteaux, s'il vous plaît? In German, an equivalent could be, Entschuldigung, können Sie mir bitte sagen, wo ich das Brot finde? Or in Italian, scusi, mi può dire dove posso trovare la marmellata? Furthermore, it is not only about the formal salutation or how to address someone in a formal way. There is also formal vocabulary, that's to say words and phrases that are commonly used in formal situations. Here are a few examples in French. Pardon, pouvez-vous m'aider? Je vous prie de m'excuser pour le retard. Je vous remercie. In German. Entschuldigung, können Sie mir bitte helfen? Wie kann ich Ihnen helfen? Wie kann ich Ihnen behilflich sein? Ich bitte um Entschuldigung für die Verspätung. Oder bitte entschuldigen Sie meine Verspätung. Vielen Dank. Ich danke Ihnen oder herzlichen Dank. In Italien, scusi, mi potrebbe aiutare per favore? Or, come la posso aiutare? Posso aiutarla? Posso esserle d'aiuto? Posso darle una mano? La prego di scusarmi per il ritardo. Mi scuso per il ritardo. La ringrazio. Grazie mille. Furthermore, formal language requires the use of more formal variants of words that we use in informal contexts. So our teenage children will probably have a broader knowledge of quasi-synonyms or acronyms in their school language. But what about their home languages? For example, if in English in an informal context we say I need or I want something, in a formal one we would rather say I require or I request or I ask for, or say may I please have. Or instead of using the word buy, which is more informal, we would say purchase, which is more formal. Or instead of saying, is it okay to do this in an informal setting, we would say, is it acceptable or allowed to do this in a more formal setting? Or I need help with the document sounds more informal than I need assistance or I need support with the document. Like Yoshito suggested before when talking about our younger children, we can also engage our teenage children in role-playing activities. We can act out different scenarios requiring formal language, like mock job interviews or a formal presentation. Hands-on practice always helps to become familiar with using formal language in real-life situations. What I personally find most important in all this is that the whole learning formal language should come as naturally as possible for our children and be related also with their reality, with their world, and that they can experiment with different forms in order to become confident using them in formal settings. Our children who grow up abroad are not exposed to a variety of registers in our languages, and it is not easy to create natural contexts for formal language use. We all learn much better by observing, listening, reading, and by doing. So our children can learn by observing and listening to us, like I said before, when we use formal language, and furthermore we can provide reading materials with a more formal writing style. Invite them to watch movies, listen to podcasts, or listen to interviews where formal language is used. And also practicing active listening in the context is often underrated. I personally have learned a lot about the use of formal language in the 6th language I'm fluent in through listening to formal speeches, presentations, and lectures. What we can do also is to follow a speech with our teens and help them identify key points and formal language used by the speaker. We can also practice note-taking techniques, but we will focus on the writing aspect related to formal language in another video. To sum it up, anything that helps with grasping the structure and tone of formal language will help. By consistently reinforcing the use of formal language and by providing guidance and offering opportunities for practice. And with practice, I mean also to give our teens the chance to try out several forms until they find the one that comes most naturally in formal settings for them. Our children will gradually develop the proficiency in formal communication in all their languages. And we can't stress this enough. Make the learning process enjoyable, age-appropriate, and relevant.
For more details and concrete examples of games to make your language fun, make sure to check out our books, The Toolbox for Multilingual Families and The Parent's Guide to Raising Multilingual Children. You'll find the links in the description below.
Let us know in the comments if you found these tips helpful, and please share some important terms and sentences in your language that are used in formal settings only.
If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to our channel to be notified whenever we publish a new video.
Have fun with your languages.